The chains rattled before the doors even opened, and Ren felt her stomach drop before she saw a single face. She had been locked in the back of a wagon for 3 days, her wrists bound with rope, her throat as silent as it had been since she was a child. When the wagon stopped and the doors were thrown open, cold mountain air rushed in, carrying the smell of pine, smoke, and something else underneath it all. Something like fear that had soaked into the very stones of the fortress ahead of her. 2 men pulled her out by the arms. She did not fight them. Fighting had never worked before, and she had learned long ago that a mute girl with no voice to scream for help had to survive by watching, waiting, and staying alive long enough to find a way through. She looked up at the fortress towering above her, black stone walls rising into gray clouds, banners snapping in the wind, with the sigil of a wolf baring its teeth. This was the home of King Draven, the man the village's 3 valleys over called the Savage Alpha King. She had heard the stories around cooking fires since she was a little girl. He crushed rebellions before they could breathe. He tore through enemy packs like a storm tore through wheat fields. Mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience. And now her own village elders had sold her to him, wrapped in a trade agreement meant to buy 3 more years of peace for people who would never think of her again. She did not cry. She had used up her tears years ago, back when her voice had been taken from her in a night she still could not fully remember, only fragments of fire and screaming, and a promise she had made to herself that she would never again be so powerless. Since then she had built her worth on what her hands could do, and her hands had learned to heal. Her grandmother had been the village healer, and Ren had followed her everywhere, learning which herbs closed wounds, which roots eased fevers, which teas calmed a racing heart. When her grandmother died, Ren had taken up the work herself, moving from house to house with her basket of dried leaves and her silent, careful hands. It was the only thing that had ever made people look at her with something other than pity. The guards marched her through an iron gate and into a courtyard filled with soldiers sharpening blades and stable hands leading horses. Every face that turned toward her carried the same guarded stillness, like people who had trained themselves not to react to anything, not even the arrival of a new servant sold in from a distant village. She noticed that. She noticed everything. It was the one skill her silence had given her, an eye for detail that most people, busy filling the air with their own words, never bothered to develop. A woman with graying hair and an apron dusted with flour met her just inside a side door. Her name, Ren would later learn, was Nora, and she ran the kitchens and the servants' quarters with a firm hand and a soft heart hidden somewhere beneath years of hard work. Nora looked Ren over, taking in the rope burns on her wrists, and something like sympathy flickered across her face before she caught herself. "You're the healer girl," Nora said, not really asking. "They told us you don't speak. That true?" Ren nodded once. "Well," Nora said, sighing as though this answered a question she had been dreading. "At least you'll be quiet about what you see here. Come on then. I'll show you where you sleep, and then you'll meet the steward. Keep your head down, girl. Whatever you've heard about this place, it's worse if you go looking for trouble." Ren followed her through narrow stone corridors, lit by torches, even though it was still daylight outside. The fortress built so thick and deep that sunlight seemed afraid to enter it. She passed servants carrying baskets of linen, guards standing at attention outside doors that seemed to lead nowhere important, and everywhere, that same tension, like a held breath that never let itself go. They passed a hallway that branched off toward a set of stairs, leading down into darkness. Ren slowed for half a step, curious, and Nora grabbed her arm hard enough to sting. "Not that way," Nora said, her voice dropping low. "Not ever. That's the East Wing, and it belongs to the king alone. No one goes down there. No one asks about it. You understand me?" Ren nodded again, though the warning did the opposite of what Nora intended. It planted a seed of curiosity in her mind, small and stubborn, the kind of seed that would not stop growing, no matter how many times she tried to pull it out. Her room was small, barely large enough for a cot and a wooden chest, tucked into a corridor near the infirmary where the wounded and sick were treated. Nora explained her duties quickly. She would assist the aging physician who tended the soldiers. She would grind herbs, change bandages, and help however she could. Her muteness, Nora said, would actually serve her well here, since the physician complained constantly and needed someone who would simply listen and work. That first night, Ren lay on her cot and stared at the low stone ceiling, listening to the sounds of the fortress settling around her. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled, and she wondered if it was a real wolf or one of the shifters that made up the king's army, men and women who could take wolf form and had built an empire out of fear and strength. She had heard that the northern wolves were fiercer than any human soldiers, faster, stronger, and utterly loyal to their alpha. She thought of her village, of the elders who had sold her without a second glance, and she found, strangely, that she felt no grief over leaving them behind. There had been nothing there for her but hunger, and the same tired faces who whispered about the cursed mute girl behind her back. Whatever waited for her here, at least it was new. At least it was a chance to matter, even in some small way. The next morning, she was put to work immediately. The infirmary was busy with soldiers nursing training injuries, a broken arm here, a deep cut there, and Wren moved through the tasks with practiced ease, cleaning wounds, mixing salves, wrapping bandages with quick, sure hands. The old physician, a stooped man named Edgar, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, watched her work for a while before grunting his approval. "Good hands," he said. "Better than the last girl they sent me. Where did you learn this?" Wren mimed grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, then pointed to herself and made a small gesture that Edgar seemed to understand meant a grandmother, a family trade passed down. "Ah," he said, "a healer's blood then. Good. We need someone who actually knows what they're doing around here." Half the soldiers that walk in complain more about the treatment than the injury. As the days passed, Wren settled into a rhythm. She rose early, worked in the infirmary through the day, ate her meals quietly in the corner of the servants' hall, and retreated to her small room each night with aching hands and a mind full of questions. She learned the names of the guards who frequented the infirmary, learned which soldiers were kind and which ones barely looked at her, learned the layout of the fortress corridor by corridor, memorizing every twist and turn the way she once memorized which herbs cured which fevers. She saw the king only from a distance in those first days, a tall figure moving through the courtyard with a presence that made even hardened soldiers straighten their backs and lower their eyes. He wore dark clothing, simple but clearly of fine make, and he moved like someone who had never once doubted his own strength. His hair was dark, his jaw sharp, and even from a distance, Wren could see the tightness in his shoulders, the way he carried himself, like a man perpetually braced for an attack that never came. The servants spoke of him only in hushed voices, and always with a strange mixture of fear and something Wren could not quite name, something closer to grief. She pieced together fragments of the story over her first week. 2 years ago, the king's mate had died. No one spoke of how. No one spoke of when, exactly, or where her body had been laid to rest. They only said that after her death, the king had changed, growing colder, harsher, prone to sudden fits of temper that made grown soldiers flinch. Wren found this strange. Grief, in her experience, made people soften, made them cling to the people around them. But everything she heard about King Draven suggested the opposite, a man who pushed everyone away, who spent hours locked in that forbidden East Wing that Nora had warned her never to approach. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Wren was called to the infirmary to help Edgar treat a guard who had taken a nasty gash to his leg during training. As she worked, cleaning the wound with careful hands, the guard, a young man named Colton with an easy, talkative manner, groaned through the pain and began to speak simply, to distract himself. "You're the quiet one," he said, wincing as Wren pressed a cloth to the cut. "The healer girl, who doesn't talk." "Good. Half the people in this place talk too much anyway. You know what they don't talk about, though? What's really down in the East Wing." Wren's hands stilled for just a moment, before she resumed her work, giving no outward sign of her interest, though her heart had begun to beat faster. "I've heard things," Colton continued, lowering his voice even though there was no one else nearby. "Sounds, sometimes. At night, guards who've been posted near there come back looking like they've seen a ghost. One fellow, Bram, he told me he heard something growling down there that didn't sound like any wolf he'd ever heard. And he's heard plenty, being what we are. King doesn't let anyone near it, not even his top commanders. Whatever's down there, he's keeping it just for himself." Edgar shot Colton a sharp look. "That's enough of that talk. You'll frighten the girl, and worse, you'll get yourself in trouble if the wrong ears hear you speculating about the king's private business." Colton fell silent, though he shot Wren an apologetic look. and she gave him a small nod to show there were no hard feelings. But inside, that seed of curiosity Nora had planted weeks ago had grown roots, deep and stubborn, and no amount of warning was going to be enough to kill it now. That night, unable to sleep, Ren lay awake, turning the guard's words over in her mind. Growling. Sounds at night. A secret locked away from even his most trusted men. She thought of the king's tired eyes, the tension that never seemed to leave his shoulders, and she found herself wondering, for the first time, if the fearsome Alpha King everyone whispered about in terror was hiding something far more complicated than simple cruelty. She did not know yet that her wondering would soon lead her, quite literally, into the dark. 3 nights later, Ren was startled awake by a sound she had never heard before, something between a growl and a sob, echoing faintly through the stone corridors of the fortress. She sat up in her narrow bed, heart pounding, and listened. The sound came again, farther away this time but unmistakable, carried on drafts of cold air that seeped through the ancient walls from somewhere deep below. Every warning Nora had given her told her to stay in bed, to pull the blanket over her head, and pretend she had heard nothing at all. But Ren had never been good at looking away from things that frightened her. Her whole life had been built on the opposite instinct, on leaning closer to the wound instead of turning from it, because healing required seeing clearly what others could not bear to look at. She rose from her bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and slipped out into the dark corridor, following the faint, haunting sound toward the branch in the hallway that led down into the forbidden East Wing. The stairway down into the East Wing was steep and narrow, cut directly into the mountain rock the fortress had been built upon centuries before. Ren pressed one hand against the cold stone wall to steady herself as she descended, each step taking her further from the warmth of the servants' quarters and deeper into a silence broken only by the distant, mournful sound that had pulled her from her bed. Her bare feet made no noise on the worn steps, a small mercy from a body that had learned long ago how to move without being noticed. The air grew colder the further she went, and torches became scarce, until she was navigating mostly by touch and by the faint orange glow that seeped from somewhere far below. She told herself she would turn back at any moment, that curiosity was not worth whatever punishment awaited a servant caught trespassing in the king's most guarded secret, but her feet kept moving anyway, carried forward by something stronger than caution. The sound came again, closer now, a low, ragged noise that sent a shiver down her spine. It was not quite an animal sound, and not quite human either, something caught painfully between the two, filled with a suffering that made her chest tighten with the instinct to help, an instinct she had never learned to ignore no matter the danger. She reached the bottom of the stairway and found herself in a wide stone corridor lined with heavy wooden doors, all closed except for one at the very end, from which the orange light spilled out onto the floor. Ren crept closer, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it could be heard through the walls, and peered carefully around the doorframe. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. A young woman sat chained to the far wall, her wrists bound in iron that had rubbed the skin beneath raw. Her hair was matted and wild. Her eyes, when they lifted toward the door, held none of the clarity of a normal person, but something feral, something trapped between awareness and animal instinct. Patches of fur seemed to ripple beneath her skin along her arms, appearing and disappearing like a tide that could not decide whether to come fully in or retreat. Before Ren could process what she was seeing, a voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Who is there?" She spun around to find King Draven standing directly behind her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines of his face, dark circles beneath eyes that studied her with a fury she had not expected, edged with something rawer underneath, something that looked almost like panic. He was larger up close than she had imagined from a distance, broad-shouldered and imposing, but in that moment, caught between her and his secret, he looked less like the savage Alpha King the villages feared, and more like a man who had just been caught doing something he was deeply ashamed of. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low and dangerous, though there was a tremor beneath it that Ren recognized immediately, the same tremor she had heard in frightened patients trying to sound brave. "No one comes down here. No one." Ren did not run, though every instinct told her she should. Instead, she held his gaze, her hands lifting slowly, palms open, a gesture she had used 100 times before to calm frightened animals and terrified patients alike. It was not defiance exactly, but it was not submission either. and she watched something shift in his expression as he registered that she was not going to scream, not going to beg, not going to react the way he clearly expected. "You cannot speak," he said slowly, memory clicking into place. "The healer girl. Ren." She nodded once. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Behind her, the chained woman let out another low sound, somewhere between a whimper and a growl, and Draven's eyes flicked past Ren toward the room, his jaw tightening with a pain so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. Ren understood, in that instant, that whatever she had stumbled into was not a simple prisoner, not some enemy the king kept locked away for cruelty's sake. This was something far more personal, something that had been eating him alive from the inside for longer than she had been in this fortress. "You will tell no one what you have seen," he said finally, his voice hardening again, the mask of the fearsome king sliding back into place like armor. "Do you understand me? If word of this reaches beyond these walls, I will know it came from you, and there will be no mercy for that betrayal." Ren nodded again, slowly, though her eyes drifted once more toward the chained woman, and she felt something twist inside her chest, the old familiar pull of her healer's instinct, refusing to be silenced even by fear. She had spent her whole life unable to speak, but she had never once been unable to see suffering clearly, and what she saw in that room was suffering of the deepest kind. Draven grabbed her arm, not roughly, but firmly, and steered her back toward the stairway, away from the chained woman and the secret he had guarded so fiercely. He did not release her until they had climbed halfway up the stone steps, and even then, his hand lingered a moment longer than necessary before he pulled it back, as though burned. "Go back to your quarters," he said. "Speak of this to no one, not Nora, not Edgar, not the other servants. If you value your life, you will forget what you saw tonight." Ren wanted desperately to ask what he could not seem to say aloud, wanted some way to communicate the questions crowding her mind, but her silence had never allowed her that luxury, and she simply nodded once more, before turning and making her way back up into the fortress proper, leaving the king standing alone at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness he had spent 2 years trying to hide from the world. She did not sleep again that night. She lay in her narrow bed replaying every detail of what she had seen, the chains, the wild eyes, the patches of fur rippling beneath skin that seemed caught between two forms. She had treated many illnesses in her years as a healer, but she had never seen anything quite like this, a condition that seemed to trap someone between human and wolf, neither one fully realized, both locked in a painful, endless struggle. The following days passed with an unbearable tension that Ren could feel pressing against her from every direction. Draven avoided the infirmary entirely, though she caught him watching her sometimes from across the courtyard, his expression unreadable, calculating, as though he were trying to decide what to do about the servant who now knew his most closely guarded secret. Nora noticed the shift immediately, though she said nothing directly, only watching Ren with a careful, searching look whenever their paths crossed. Ren wondered if the older woman suspected something, but she gave nothing away, keeping her silence as absolute as it had always been, letting her work in the infirmary continue as though nothing at all had changed. Edgar, at least, remained oblivious, too consumed with his own complaints about aching joints and understaffed quarters to notice anything unusual in his quiet assistant's behavior. He continued to teach her small things as they worked, showing her rare herbs he kept locked away for emergencies, explaining the properties of poisons that could kill or cure depending on the dose, knowledge that Ren absorbed hungrily, never certain when such things might prove useful. 4 days after her discovery, Draven summoned her directly for the first time, sending a guard to fetch her from the infirmary in the middle of the afternoon. Ren followed the guard through corridors she now recognized with growing familiarity, her stomach twisting with a mixture of fear and something else she could not quite name, anticipation perhaps, or the strange thrill of being trusted with something dangerous. She found the king alone in a small study, standing before a cold hearth with his back to the door, his shoulders rigid with the same tension she had noticed the very first time she saw him across the courtyard. He did not turn immediately when she entered, and she waited in silence, accustomed to waiting, accustomed to letting others fill the silence with words, while she simply observed. "You have not spoken of what you saw," he said finally, still facing away from her. It was not quite a question. Ren shook her head, though he could not see the gesture, and then, remembering, she cleared her throat softly, a small sound that made him turn at last. She nodded firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Something in his posture eased, just slightly, the tightly coiled tension in his shoulders loosening by a fraction. "Good," he said. I did not expect you to keep silent so easily. Most people cannot resist the temptation of a secret, especially one as valuable as mine would be to my enemies." Ren tilted her head slightly, a silent invitation for him to continue, and after a long moment, he seemed to decide something, some internal battle resolving itself in his mind. "The woman you saw," he said slowly, each word costing him visible effort, "was my mate. Everyone believes she died 2 years ago. I have let them believe it, because the truth would destroy everything I have built to protect this kingdom, and because I could not bear the thought of anyone else seeing her as she is now." Ren's eyes widened slightly, and she pressed a hand to her chest, a wordless expression of understanding, of sympathy, though she did not yet know the full weight of what he was telling her. "She was cursed," he continued, his voice growing rougher, "by an enemy pack that wanted to weaken me, to destroy the one thing that made me vulnerable. They could not kill me directly, so instead, they trapped her between her human form and her wolf form, leaving her caught in that half-state you saw, unable to fully become either one, suffering in ways I cannot even describe to you." He turned fully to face her now, and for the first time, Ren saw past the fearsome mask the kingdom knew him by, saw instead a man hollowed out by grief and helplessness, a man who had spent 2 years searching desperately for answers that never came. "I have brought healers from 3 kingdoms," he said. "Wise women, physicians, even a witch who claimed she could break any curse for the right price. None of them could help her. Most of them made things worse, and I have had to bury the failures of my desperation, along with my hope." Ren stepped closer, her healer's instincts overriding whatever fear she might have felt, and she reached out slowly, placing a hand gently on his arm, a gesture meant to convey what her voice never could, that she understood suffering, that she had built her entire life around trying to ease it wherever she found it. Draven looked down at her hand on his arm, and something in his rigid posture finally broke, just slightly, just enough for her to see the exhaustion underneath, the 2 years of carrying this burden entirely alone, hiding it from a kingdom that would see any weakness as an invitation for attack. "I need your help," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him more than any battle he had ever fought. "I have heard of your skill with herbs, with old remedies your grandmother taught you. I do not know if you can do anything that a dozen other healers could not, but I am out of options, and I am running out of time before the curse consumes whatever remains of who she used to be." Ren nodded slowly, solemnly, understanding the weight of what he was asking of her. Understanding, too, that this was no longer simply a secret she had stumbled upon by accident, but a burden he was choosing to share with her, trusting her with the one thing that could destroy him, if it ever became known. She did not know yet whether she could help the chained woman in the dungeon below, did not know whether her grandmother's remedies would prove any more useful than the failed attempts of witches and physicians from 3 kingdoms. But she knew, standing there in that quiet study with the fearsome Alpha King bearing the rawest part of himself before her, that she was no longer simply a servant sold into an unfamiliar fortress. She had become something else entirely, something that would change the course of everything that followed. That evening, Draven led Ren down into the East Wing himself, a lantern in one hand, his other hand hovering near her elbow as though he expected her to bolt at any moment, or perhaps as though he needed the reassurance of her steady presence beside him. The corridor felt different this time, less like a forbidden place she had trespassed into, and more like a threshold she was being formally invited to cross, though the weight of what waited beyond it remained just as heavy. The chained woman looked up as they entered, her eyes tracking the lantern light with the wary alertness of a cornered animal. Ren studied her carefully now, no longer stealing a frightened glance from the doorway, but observing with the full attention of a healer assessing a patient. She noted the way patches of fur rippled beneath the skin, along the woman's arms and shoulders, appearing and vanishing in slow waves, as though her body were caught in a tide pulling her simultaneously in 2 directions. "Her name is Faye," Draven said quietly, setting the lantern on a small table near the door. "She was gentle once. She loved gardens and old songs, and used to laugh at the smallest things. I do not know how much of her remains inside whatever this curse has made of her now." Ren knelt slowly, a careful distance away, moving with the same unhurried patience she used when approaching frightened animals or terrified children, letting Faye see every motion before she made it. giving her time to adjust to a stranger's presence. Faye's eyes followed her, wary but not immediately hostile, and Ren took that as a small, cautious sign of hope. She examined what she could without getting too close, noting the raw skin beneath the iron chains, the slightly yellowed tint to Faye's eyes that suggested some kind of toxin working through her system, and strange markings along her collarbone that looked almost like old scarring, though the pattern was too deliberate, too symmetrical to be accidental. Ren had seen markings like that once before, faintly, in an old book her grandmother kept locked in a chest, a book filled with remedies and warnings about the darker forms of magic that some practitioners use to bind or curse the unwilling. She gestured to Draven, miming the shape of a book, and he frowned in confusion for a moment, before understanding dawned. "You want to know if there are records," he said. "Written accounts of the curse, of what was done to her." Ren nodded eagerly, and Draven's expression shifted, thoughtful now instead of merely desperate. "The witch I hired to examine her left notes before I dismissed her, uncertain of her methods. I have not looked at them in months, convinced they held nothing useful. Perhaps I was wrong to give up on them so quickly." He led Ren to a locked chest in a small side chamber, retrieving a stack of yellowed papers covered in cramped handwriting, diagrams of curse symbols, and notes about ingredients that meant little to Draven, but made Ren's pulse quicken with recognition. She recognized several of the herbs mentioned, plants her grandmother had warned her about, powerful in their properties but dangerous if used incorrectly, capable of binding a person's very essence if combined in the wrong ratios. Over the following hour, working by lantern light, while Faye watched from her chains with an unsettling stillness, Ren pieced together fragments of understanding from the witch's abandoned notes. The curse, it seemed, had used a rare poisonous herb called moonshade root, combined with a blood-binding ritual that trapped the victim's shifting ability in a permanent state of transition, neither fully human nor fully wolf, an agony that would only worsen over time, as the body fought endlessly against itself. Ren had seen something similar once in her own village, years before she was sold to the fortress, when a traveling merchant had fallen ill after eating tainted meat laced unknowingly with a related toxin. Her grandmother had treated him with a careful combination of purging herbs and a binding tea meant to draw the poison out through the skin rather than the blood, a slow and delicate process that had taken weeks but had ultimately saved the man's life. She began sketching notes of her own on a scrap of parchment, using simple pictures and symbols since her hands could convey what her voice could not, showing Draven the herbs she believed might counteract what had been done to Faye. He watched her work with an intensity that made her skin warm, despite the cold dampness of the dungeon air, his earlier desperation, now tempered by something that looked almost like cautious hope, an emotion she suspected he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. "You believe you can help her," he said, not quite a question, though his voice carried a note of disbelief, as though he were afraid to trust the possibility too fully. Ren hesitated, then nodded slowly, careful not to overpromise something she could not yet guarantee. She held up a hand, fingers spread, then folded them down one at a time, a gesture meant to convey caution, to show that this would take time, careful preparation, and no small amount of risk. "Whatever time it takes," Draven said immediately. "Whatever risk it requires, I will provide it. I have wasted 2 years chasing false promises from healers who claimed certainty they did not possess. If you offer only caution and honesty, that is more than anyone else has given me since this began." Over the following days, Ren threw herself into the work with a focus that left little room for anything else. She spent her mornings in the infirmary as usual, tending to soldiers and servants under Edgar's watchful eye, but her afternoons were increasingly claimed by Draven, who found excuses to send for her, ostensibly to consult on Faye's condition, but often simply to sit with her in his study, watching her work through the witch's old notes with an attentiveness that surprised them both. She requested access to the fortress's small garden, where she discovered a modest collection of herbs cultivated by a groundskeeper who had little idea of their true medicinal value. She spent hours there in the fading autumn light, gathering what she needed, testing combinations in small batches, careful never to waste the rare ingredients Draven procured for her at considerable expense and secrecy, sending trusted messengers to distant markets under false pretenses to avoid drawing attention to what was truly being sought. Nora noticed the change in Ren's schedule, of course, though she said nothing beyond a few pointed looks and the occasional comment about the healer girl keeping strange hours these days. Ren wondered sometimes if Nora suspected the truth, or some version close enough to it. But the older woman's discretion, whether born of loyalty or simple self-preservation, kept whatever suspicions she harbored safely behind her lips. Edgar, for his part, grew increasingly curious about the herbs Ren requested him to help identify or prepare, some of them rare enough that even his decades of experience left him puzzled. She deflected his questions as best she could, miming vague explanations about experimental remedies for a difficult case among the soldiers, and while he clearly did not fully believe her, his respect for her skill kept him from pressing too hard. The soldiers in the infirmary, meanwhile, had begun to notice a subtle shift in their king's demeanor as well. Colton, still recovering slowly from his leg injury, mentioned to Ren one afternoon that the king seemed less prone to sudden outbursts of temper lately, that his commanders had commented quietly among themselves about a lightness in his manner that none of them had seen since before his mate's supposed death. "Whatever's changed," Colton said, watching Ren carefully as she changed his bandage. "I'd wager it has something to do with you, Quiet One. You've been summoned to his study more times this month than any servant I've heard of in years. People are starting to talk." Ren kept her expression carefully neutral, though inwardly, she felt a flicker of alarm at the idea that their private arrangement might already be drawing attention. She gave Colton a small, warning look, and he raised his hands in mock surrender, understanding without needing further explanation that this was not a topic to pursue further. That evening, she relayed her concerns to Draven as best she could, using the simple system of gestures and written notes they had developed between them over the past weeks. He frowned deeply at her warning, clearly troubled by the idea that his commanders might be speculating about the nature of their meetings. "Let them speculate," he said finally, though his tone carried less confidence than his words suggested. "As long as they do not speculate correctly, a little gossip about a king favoring his healer is far less dangerous than the truth of what lies beneath this fortress." But Ren could see the worry etched into the lines of his face, the fear that his careful 2-year secret might unravel, not through any grand betrayal, but through the simple, mundane observation of servants noticing patterns in his schedule. She resolved to be more careful, to space out her visits, to give Edgar more convincing explanations for her absences, though she knew that eventually, the work she was doing would require risks that no amount of careful scheduling could fully disguise. As the days shortened into the deepest part of autumn, Ren finally settled on a treatment plan, drawing from her grandmother's old remedies, the witch's abandoned notes, and her own careful reasoning about how the moonshade root's poison might be drawn out through a combination of purging herbs and a binding tea, similar to what had saved the merchant in her village years before. It would not be a simple process. It would require Faye to endure days of physical suffering as the poison worked its way out of her system, and there was no guarantee that the treatment would fully break the curse, rather than simply easing its symptoms temporarily. She presented her plan to Draven one evening in his study, using her careful sketches and gestures to walk him through each step, watching his face carefully for any sign that the risks were too much for him to bear. He listened in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on her drawings, with an intensity that spoke of a man weighing an impossible decision. "If this fails," he said finally, his voice rough, "if this makes things worse instead of better, I do not know what I will do. She is the only piece of my old life that remains, the only proof that I was once something other than what this crown has made me." Ren reached out and placed her hand over his, a gesture she had used before, but which felt heavier now, weighted with the understanding that whatever came next would change both of their lives irrevocably, whether for better or for worse. The night before the treatment was set to begin, Ren could not sleep, her mind racing through every step of the plan, checking and rechecking the proportions of herbs she had measured out earlier that evening. She had learned long ago that doubt, left unchecked, could poison careful work just as thoroughly as any toxin, and so she forced herself to breathe slowly, to trust the knowledge her grandmother had spent years passing down to her, knowledge that had never failed her before, when applied with patience and care. She rose before dawn and made her way quietly to the small chamber Draven had prepared, adjacent to the dungeon room where Faye remained chained, a space he had cleared and cleaned specifically for this purpose, bringing in fresh linens and warm blankets, despite the underground chill. He was already there when Ren arrived, having apparently not slept at all, his eyes rimmed with the particular exhaustion of a man carrying the weight of hope and fear in equal measure. Together, without words on Ren's part, and with only quiet murmurs from Draven, they began the treatment. Ren prepared the first purging tea, a bitter concoction she had brewed the night before, and Draven helped hold Faye steady while Ren carefully administered small amounts, watching closely for any adverse reaction. Faye's body trembled and convulsed slightly as the tea began its work, her wild eyes rolling back briefly before focusing again, more lucid than Ren had seen them before, though still clouded with confusion and pain. The first day passed in a haze of careful monitoring, Ren rarely leaving Faye's side, except to gather more supplies or check her notes against the symptoms she observed. Draven remained close as well, canceling meetings with his commanders and sending vague explanations through trusted messengers about matters requiring his personal attention. His absence from his usual duties did not go unnoticed, and Ren could sense the growing unease among the fortress staff, whispers about the king's strange behavior multiplying by the hour. By the second day, Faye's fever had spiked considerably, her skin burning to the touch as the poison began working its way toward the surface, exactly as Ren had predicted, based on her grandmother's old notes about similar treatments. This was the most dangerous part of the process, the point at which the body fought hardest against the purging, and Ren stayed awake through the entire night, applying cool compresses and monitoring Faye's breathing with the vigilance of someone who understood that a single misstep could mean the difference between recovery and disaster. Draven, unable to simply watch and wait, insisted on helping wherever he could, fetching water, holding Faye steady during the worst of her convulsions, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he cradled her against the pain. Ren found herself watching him during these quiet, desperate hours, noting the way his fearsome reputation seemed to dissolve entirely in the face of genuine tenderness, revealing instead a man who had simply been broken by loss and forced to wear strength, like armor, over a wound that had never properly healed. On the third day, as the fever finally began to break, something remarkable happened. Faye's eyes, which had remained wild and unfocused since Ren's first glimpse of her weeks before, suddenly cleared, locking onto Draven's face, with a flicker of genuine recognition that made the king freeze completely, afraid to breathe, lest he shatter whatever fragile moment was unfolding. "Draven?" Faye's voice came out cracked and rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably clear, unmistakably herself, for the first time in 2 years. Draven made a sound Ren had never heard from him before, something between a sob and a laugh, and he gathered Faye carefully into his arms, careful of her weakened state, murmuring her name over and over, as though testing whether this moment was real, or simply another cruel dream that would dissolve if he held it too tightly. Ren stepped back to give them privacy, her own eyes stinging with unexpected emotion, satisfaction mixing with something more complicated that she did not yet have a name for, a small ache she chose not to examine too closely in that moment of triumph. She busied herself instead with preparing the next stage of treatment, the binding tea, that would help stabilize whatever progress they had made, and prevent the curse from simply reasserting itself once the initial purging had run its course. The moment of clarity, however, proved fleeting. Within an hour, Faye's eyes clouded again, the wildness returning, as her body shifted once more into the painful half-state between human and wolf, and her brief words of recognition dissolved back into confused, animal sounds that made Draven's face crumple with fresh devastation. Ren moved quickly to reassure him, gesturing that this was expected, that the curse would not release its grip after a single treatment, that these brief windows of clarity were themselves a sign of progress, proof that the poison was indeed being drawn out, even if the full cure remained days or weeks away. Draven seemed to understand, though the sight of Faye slipping back into confusion after finally hearing her voice again clearly seemed to cost him something he could not easily articulate. Over the following week, the pattern repeated itself. Periods of painful purging, followed by brief windows of clarity that grew slightly longer each time, then relapses back into the confused half-state, though each relapse seemed slightly less severe than the one before. Ren adjusted her treatments carefully, based on what she observed, consulting the witch's old notes alongside her own instincts, refining the balance of herbs as Faye's body responded to each new stage of the process. Draven remained a near-constant presence throughout, his devotion to Faye's recovery unwavering, even as it grew clear that his prolonged absence from his duties was causing genuine concern among his commanders. One evening, a senior officer named Garrick, a broad-shouldered man with a scarred face and a reputation for blunt honesty, cornered Draven in the fortress hallway, his voice low but urgent. "My king," Garrick said, "your absence has not gone unnoticed. There are whispers among the men, questions about your fitness to lead if you cannot be bothered to attend to matters of state. I do not say this to accuse you, only to warn you that whatever business occupies your time so completely, it cannot continue indefinitely without consequence." Draven's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ren, who had been passing quietly nearby with a tray of herbs, feared he might lash out with the old temper the servants still whispered about. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of Garrick's words, even as his eyes carried the weight of an impossible choice between his duties as king and his devotion to the woman slowly healing in the chamber below. "You are right to raise this concern," Draven said finally. "Give me until the end of the week. If I cannot resolve this matter by then, I will address the council directly and explain what circumstances have required my attention." Garrick studied him for a long moment, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to press further, and finally nodded, retreating back toward the courtyard with a final glance that suggested he would not remain patient indefinitely. That night, Draven relayed the conversation to Ren, his frustration evident even through his attempt to remain composed. "I cannot keep this secret forever," he admitted, sitting heavily in a chair near Faye's bedside while she slept fitfully, her body still fighting the last vestiges of the curse's grip. "Eventually, I will have to tell them something, and I do not know if the kingdom will accept the truth of what has happened here, or if they will see only weakness, an opportunity for enemies to exploit." Ren considered this carefully, then gestured for parchment, writing out a simple question in her careful hand. What if the truth becomes a strength instead of a weakness? A king who fought 2 years to save his mate, rather than abandoning her to a curse, might earn more loyalty than one who simply mourned and moved on. Draven read her words slowly, turning the idea over in his mind, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of possibility he had not previously considered. "You believe my people would see it that way? That they would respect devotion over decisive cruelty?" Ren nodded firmly, though privately, she understood that convincing an entire kingdom to reconsider its perception of its king would require more than simple hope. It would require Faye's full recovery, undeniable proof that the years of secrecy had been worth the sacrifice, and perhaps most importantly, it would require Draven himself to believe that vulnerability could coexist with strength, a lesson that seemed to challenge everything his years of rule had taught him. As the second week of treatment drew to a close, Faye's periods of clarity grew steadily longer, her recognition of her surroundings and of Draven becoming more consistent, though the physical transformation remained incomplete, patches of fur still rippling occasionally along her arms during moments of stress or exhaustion. Ren began to believe, cautiously, that a full recovery was within reach, though she knew the most delicate part of the treatment still lay ahead, the final ritual needed to fully sever the curse's hold and allow Faye's body to choose freely between her human and wolf forms once more. With Faye's condition steadily improving, Draven found himself facing the council sooner than he had anticipated, as Garrick's warning about growing unrest among the commanders proved well-founded. Word had spread through the fortress that something significant occupied the king's attention, and rumors multiplied in the absence of official explanation, ranging from whispers of illness to darker speculation about plots against the crown that Draven was supposedly investigating in secret. He called the council together on a cold morning, the great hall filled with commanders, advisors, and senior members of the Northern Wolves Pack, all watching their king with expressions ranging from concern to poorly concealed suspicion. Ren was not present for this meeting, remaining instead in the chamber below with Faye, but Draven relayed the details to her later that evening, his relief palpable as he described how the confrontation had unfolded. He had chosen, in the end, to tell them a version of the truth, explaining that his mate had not died 2 years before as everyone believed, but had instead been cursed by enemies seeking to weaken him, and that he had spent the intervening years searching desperately for a cure, rather than accepting her loss. He did not reveal every detail, keeping Ren's specific roles somewhat vague to protect her from becoming a target for whatever enemies might still wish the curse to remain unbroken, but he spoke with a rawness that surprised even himself, admitting to a vulnerability he had spent 2 years hiding behind a mask of increasing harshness. The reaction, according to Draven, had been more complicated than simple relief or celebration. Some among the council, particularly the older commanders who remembered Faye from before the curse, seemed genuinely moved by the revelation, understanding at last the source of their king's changed temperament, and finding in it not weakness, but a depth of loyalty they had not previously credited him with. Others, however, particularly younger officers eager to prove themselves through decisive action, expressed concern that 2 years of secrecy suggested poor judgment, a king so consumed by personal grief that he had neglected the wider concerns of his kingdom. Garrick, notably, had spoken in Draven's defense, reminding the assembled council that a leader capable of such fierce devotion to those he loved was precisely the kind of leader worth following into battle, someone who would never abandon his people the way he had refused to abandon his cursed mate. His words seemed to shift the tone of the room, and while questions remained about the specifics of the cure and the identity of the healer responsible, the immediate crisis of confidence in Draven's leadership appeared, for the moment, to have been averted. Ren listened to this account with a growing sense of unease, understanding that while Draven had protected her identity for now, the curiosity surrounding the mysterious healer who had accomplished what witches and physicians from 3 kingdoms could not, would only grow stronger, as Faye's recovery became more widely known. She resolved to remain as inconspicuous as possible, continuing her infirmary duties with Edgar exactly as before, giving no outward indication of the extraordinary work she had been conducting in secret. This resolve proved harder to maintain than she had hoped. Nora, whose sharp eyes missed very little that happened within the fortress walls, approached Ren one evening as she prepared for bed, her expression carrying a weight of unspoken understanding that made Ren's stomach tighten with apprehension. "I've heard the whispers," Nora said quietly, closing the door behind her to ensure privacy. "About the king's mate, about a healer who worked some kind of miracle down in that forbidden wing. I'm not a fool, girl. I've seen how often you've been summoned these past weeks, seen the herbs you've requested that go far beyond anything a fortress infirmary would normally need." Ren's expression remained carefully neutral, though her heart pounded, uncertain what Nora intended to do with her suspicions. To her surprise, the older woman's face softened, and she reached out to pat Ren's hand gently. "You needn't worry that I'll speak of it," Nora continued. "Whatever you've done, if it's brought some healing to this fortress after 2 years of misery, then I count you a blessing rather than a threat. Just be careful, girl. Not everyone in this kingdom wishes our king well, and a healer capable of breaking curses makes a valuable target for those who might wish to use you against him." This warning settled into Ren's mind with uncomfortable weight over the following days, a reminder that her growing involvement in the fortress's most closely guarded secret carried risks beyond simple discovery by curious servants. She began paying closer attention to unfamiliar faces among the fortress staff, wondering if any of them might be spies for the rival pack responsible for cursing Faye in the first place, though she had no way of knowing what that pack even looked like, or where their true loyalties lay. Meanwhile, Faye's recovery continued its steady, if uneven, progress. Her periods of clarity now lasted for hours at a time rather than mere minutes, and she had begun speaking more fully, her memories returning in fragmented pieces that sometimes brought joy and sometimes brought fresh grief, as she remembered details of the life the curse had stolen from her. Ren spent hours by her bedside during these lucid periods, communicating through her careful system of gestures and written notes, and slowly, a fragile friendship began to form between the 2 women, despite the strange circumstances of their connection. Faye, once she understood the full extent of what Ren had risked and sacrificed to help her, expressed a gratitude that went beyond simple words. Though she also seemed to notice something in the way Ren and Draven interacted that neither of them had fully acknowledged even to themselves. During one quiet afternoon, while Draven was occupied elsewhere in the fortress attending to overdue matters of state, Faye caught Ren's hand and studied her face with unexpected intensity. "He looks at you differently than he ever looked at anyone else, even me, before all this happened," Faye said quietly, her voice still carrying the rough edges of disuse, but growing steadier each day. "I do not say this to cause you distress, only because I think someone should acknowledge it before it becomes a complication none of us are prepared to face." Ren shook her head firmly, gesturing that Faye was mistaken, that whatever attention Draven paid her was simply gratitude for her healing skills, nothing more. But even as she made these gestures, she felt the hollow ring of her own denial, aware of feelings that had been growing quietly within her over the weeks of shared secrets and desperate hope, feelings she had not allowed herself to fully examine, because doing so felt like a betrayal of the very woman she had worked so hard to save. Faye, watching her carefully, seemed to see through the denial easily enough, though she did not press the matter further, instead squeezing Ren's hand with something like understanding, rather than accusation. 2 years is a long time to grieve someone who was never truly gone, she said softly. I do not know what I will find when I finally return fully to myself, whether the connection Draven and I shared before the curse can simply resume as though no time has passed at all. Perhaps it is foolish of me to speak of such things before I am even fully healed, but I have had a great deal of time trapped in silence to think about what matters most, and I find that his happiness matters more to me than my own certainty about what our future should look like. This conversation left Ren deeply unsettled, uncertain how to process feelings she had tried so hard to suppress, in service of her duty as a healer, uncertain too what Faye's words meant for the delicate situation unfolding within the fortress walls. She threw herself back into her work, with renewed focus, preparing for the final stage of Faye's treatment, the binding ritual that would fully sever the curse's hold, and determine, once and for all, whether her grandmother's remedies and her own careful adaptations had been enough to undo 2 years of dark magic. The ritual, according to the witch's notes, would require a specific combination of rare herbs burned together in precise proportions, combined with a blood offering from both the cursed individual and someone bound to them by genuine care. A detail that gave Ren pause when she first read it, understanding immediately that this meant either Draven or herself would need to participate directly, in a way far more intimate than simply preparing remedies from a careful distance. She brought this information to Draven that evening, watching his expression as he processed the implications, the necessity of a blood offering that would bind him even more deeply to the outcome of the ritual, whatever that outcome might reveal about the true state of his feelings after 2 years of forced separation from the woman he had once loved without complication. Whatever this ritual requires of me, Draven said finally, I will provide it. I have not come this far to hesitate now, not when we stand so close to finally freeing her from this curse entirely. Ren nodded, though something in her chest tightened at his words, a complicated mixture of pride in how far they had come together, and a quiet, unacknowledged fear about what full success might mean for the fragile, undefined connection that had grown between herself and the king over these past weeks of shared purpose and secret desperation. Preparing for the ritual required a level of precision that left little room for error, and Ren spent the following days poring over the witch's notes, again and again, cross-referencing them against her grandmother's teachings, to ensure she understood every step correctly. A mistake at this stage, after weeks of careful progress, could undo everything they had achieved, or worse, could cause harm to Faye that no amount of subsequent treatment could reverse. The herbs required for the final ritual were rarer than anything Ren had used before, ingredients that grew only in specific conditions found in distant mountain regions, plants whose names she recognized only from the oldest pages of her grandmother's book, warnings scrawled in the margins about their potency and the care required in their handling. Draven, once again, sent trusted messengers to procure what was needed, though this time the search took considerably longer, and Ren found herself growing anxious as days turned into a full week without word of success. During this waiting period, she continued visiting Faye daily, watching her recovery progress steadily, even without the final ritual, her periods of clarity now stretching through entire days, with only occasional, brief relapses into confusion, during moments of exhaustion or stress. The two women had grown genuinely close during these weeks, their initial strange circumstances giving way to something resembling real friendship, built on shared understanding of suffering, and the particular intimacy that comes from one person nursing another back from the edge of something terrible. Faye asked Ren, during one of these quiet afternoons, about her life before the fortress, about the childhood trauma that had taken her voice, and the family who had eventually sold her into service here. Ren found herself sharing these details more openly than she had with anyone in years, using her careful gestures and written notes to convey fragments of a story she had never fully told another living soul. The fire that had taken her voice, the promise she had made to herself in its aftermath, the years of building worth through her healing hands, because her words had been stolen from her before she had learned to use them fully. Faye listened with genuine compassion, her own experience of being silenced by circumstances beyond her control giving her particular insight into what Ren must have endured. "We are both women who have had something essential taken from us," Faye observed quietly. "You lost your voice, and I lost 2 years of my life to a curse that stole my very form from me. Perhaps that is part of why healing came to you so naturally when it came to my situation, an understanding of what it means to be trapped by something beyond your control." This observation struck Ren deeply, and she found herself considering, for the first time, whether her connection to Faye's suffering ran deeper than simple professional dedication, whether some part of her had recognized in Faye's chains an echo of her own long silence, a kinship that made her healing work feel less like duty and more like a personal mission to free someone else from the kind of trap she herself had spent years learning to survive within. Nearly 10 days after the search for the final ritual ingredients had begun, Draven's messenger returned with the last of what was needed, a rare mountain flower called Silverbloom that grew only at high altitudes during specific seasons, along with several other components that completed the precise combination the ritual required. Ren examined each ingredient carefully upon its arrival, verifying quality and freshness against her grandmother's exacting standards, aware that the ritual's success depended entirely on getting every detail exactly correct. They scheduled the ritual for the night of the full moon, a choice Ren made deliberately based on notes in the witch's papers, suggesting that lunar cycles affected the potency of shifter magic, whether curse or cure. As the appointed night approached, Ren found herself unable to shake a growing tension that had little to do with the technical demands of the ritual itself, and everything to do with the emotional complexity of what success might mean for the 3 people whose lives had become so tangled together over the preceding weeks. The night finally arrived, clear and cold, moonlight streaming through the narrow windows high above the dungeon corridor, as Ren prepared the ritual space with careful precision, arranging the herbs in the exact pattern the witch's notes described, setting small dishes for the burning components at precise intervals around where Faye would sit, no longer chained now that her periods of lucidity had grown so consistent, though Draven remained close by regardless, unwilling to risk any complication during this final, crucial stage. Ren explained the ritual's requirements as best she could, through her gestures and written notes, watching both Draven and Faye absorb the information, with expressions of solemn determination. The blood offering would need to come from Draven, a small but symbolically significant wound that would bind his devotion directly into the ritual's power, while Ren herself would guide the burning of the herbs and the timing of each stage, her steady hands and careful attention to detail serving as the anchor that would hold the entire process together. As midnight approached and the full moon reached its highest point, Ren began the ritual, lighting the first combination of herbs and watching the smoke curl upward in patterns that matched exactly what the witch's notes had described as the sign of proper preparation. Faye sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the flickering flame, while Draven knelt beside her, his expression a mixture of hope and barely controlled fear, as Ren guided him through the small ceremonial cut that would provide the necessary blood offering. The moment his blood touched the burning herbs, the smoke shifted color entirely, deepening from pale gray to a rich, almost violet hue that made all 3 of them tense with anticipation. Faye gasped suddenly, her body arching as though struck by an invisible force, and Ren moved quickly to steady her, watching carefully for any sign that the ritual was proceeding correctly, rather than causing harm. For several long, agonizing minutes, nothing seemed to happen beyond Faye's continued trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps, as whatever internal battle the ritual had triggered played out beneath her skin. Draven gripped her hand tightly, murmuring words of encouragement, while Ren monitored the burning herbs, adjusting the mixture slightly, according to the notes whenever the smoke's color began to shift, in ways that suggested the process needed correction. Then, gradually, the patches of fur that had rippled beneath Faye's skin for 2 long years began to smooth away entirely, her form settling fully and completely into her human shape for the first time since the curse had first taken hold. Her breathing steadied, her trembling eased, and when she finally opened her eyes again, the clarity in them held none of the flickering uncertainty that had marked even her best moments of lucidity throughout her recovery. She was, unmistakably, fully and completely herself once more. "It worked," Draven breathed, his voice cracking with an emotion so raw that Ren felt tears prick at her own eyes, simply witnessing it. Faye, it worked. You are free. Faye laughed, a sound rich with genuine joy that seemed to fill the entire underground chamber, and she reached for Draven, pulling him into an embrace that spoke of 2 years of separation finally, truly ended. Ren stepped back to give them privacy, her heart swelling with satisfaction at the success of her work, even as something quieter and more complicated stirred beneath that satisfaction. An awareness that this moment of triumph also marked, in some ways, the natural conclusion of the strange, intimate arrangement that had grown between herself and Draven over these past intense weeks. She busied herself with cleaning up the ritual materials, giving the reunited couple space to process this monumental change, though she could not help but notice, even in her peripheral vision, the way Draven's eyes occasionally flickered toward her over Faye's shoulder, an expression on his face that seemed to carry more complexity than simple relief at his mate's recovery. Later that night, once Faye had finally fallen into peaceful, natural sleep for the first time in 2 years, no longer plagued by the restless half-consciousness of her cursed state, Draven found Ren in the small garden where she had spent so many hours gathering herbs for this very purpose. The moon still hung high and bright above them, casting silver light across the careful rows of plants she had tended throughout the autumn. "I do not know how to properly thank you," he said quietly, standing close beside her among the herb beds. "You have given me back something I believed was lost forever. There are no words sufficient for what that means to me." Ren shook her head slightly, gesturing that no thanks were necessary, that she had simply done what any healer would do when presented with suffering that could be eased. But Draven caught her hand before she could turn away, his grip gentle but insistent, and when she looked up at him, she saw in his eyes a conflict that mirrored her own carefully suppressed feelings, a complication neither of them had anticipated when this strange arrangement had first begun weeks ago in the depths of his forbidden dungeon. Neither of them moved for a long moment, standing close together in the moonlit garden, the weight of unspoken feelings pressing heavily between them. Ren finally pulled her hand back gently, shaking her head to indicate that whatever he might be feeling in this moment of overwhelming relief and gratitude was not something either of them should act upon. Not now. Not with Faye finally restored and sleeping peacefully just a short distance away. Draven seemed to understand her meaning, without need for further explanation, and he stepped back slightly, running a hand through his dark hair with an expression of frustrated confusion, as though he himself did not fully understand the feelings warring within him. "You are right, of course," he said quietly. "Forgive me. This has been an emotional night, and I fear my gratitude has confused itself with something else entirely." Ren offered him a small, understanding smile, though inwardly she felt the same confusion he described, aware that whatever had grown between them over these intense weeks of shared purpose could not simply be dismissed as gratitude alone, not on her part, and perhaps not fully on his either. But she also understood, with the same clear-eyed practicality that had guided her through every difficult healing she had ever performed, that acting on such feelings now, in the immediate aftermath of Faye's recovery, would be both premature and potentially devastating to a woman who had just reclaimed her life after 2 years of suffering. She gestured toward the fortress, indicating that they should both return inside, that rest was needed after the intensity of the ritual, and Draven nodded, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer before he turned to walk beside her back through the quiet, moonlit courtyard. The following days brought a flurry of activity as news of Faye's full recovery spread through the fortress and, inevitably, beyond its walls into the wider kingdom. Draven called another council meeting, this time with Faye present at his side, her restored presence serving as undeniable proof of everything he had claimed weeks before about the curse and his years of secret struggle to break it. The reaction among the commanders and advisors was overwhelmingly positive. Many of them moved to genuine emotion at seeing their king's mate return to full health after believing her lost for so long. Garrick, in particular, seemed deeply affected by the reunion, approaching Draven, after the meeting, with a rare display of open emotion for the normally stoic commander. "I have followed you into battle for 15 years, my king," he said, his scarred face solemn. "I have seen you show mercy, and I have seen you show ruthlessness in equal measure, but I have never seen you show the kind of devotion you have shown these past 2 years, hidden though it was from all of us. This kingdom is fortunate to have a leader capable of such loyalty." Word of the healer responsible for this miraculous cure spread quickly as well, and Ren found herself, much to her discomfort, becoming something of a subject of fascination among the fortress staff and visiting dignitaries who arrived to pay respects to the restored Fae. She had never sought attention, had spent her entire life cultivating invisibility as a survival skill, and the sudden scrutiny left her feeling exposed in ways she had not anticipated when she first began working to break the curse weeks before. Faye, for her part, seemed to notice Ren's discomfort with the attention, and made a point of deflecting some of the curiosity away from her whenever possible, speaking warmly of Ren's skill, without revealing more personal details than necessary, or to satisfy the kingdom's understandable curiosity. This kindness only deepened the complicated guilt Ren felt regarding her own suppressed feelings toward Draven, aware that Faye had shown her nothing but genuine friendship and gratitude throughout this entire ordeal, making any romantic complications feel like a betrayal of that friendship regardless of how carefully she tried to suppress her own emotions. As the weeks passed and life within the fortress began settling into a new, more peaceful rhythm, Ren noticed subtle changes in the dynamic between Draven and Faye that troubled her in ways she tried hard not to examine too closely. While their reunion had clearly brought them both genuine joy, there remained an underlying tension in their interactions, a careful distance that seemed to belie the passionate devotion Draven had shown throughout the weeks of secret treatment. Faye herself broached this subject directly one afternoon, finding Ren alone in the infirmary during a quiet moment between patients. "I know you have noticed it too," Faye said without preamble, settling into a chair near where Ren worked. "The distance between Draven and me, even now that I am fully restored. I do not think either of us quite knows how to bridge 2 years of separation. How to simply return to who we were before the curse, as though nothing has changed in between." Ren listened carefully, uncertain how to respond given her own complicated feelings about the situation. But Faye continued, before she could formulate any gesture in reply. "I have had a great deal of time to think, trapped in that half-state, watching the world pass by without being able to fully participate in it. I think, in some ways, I became a different person during those 2 years, even if my body has now been restored to what it once was, and I think Draven has changed as well, shaped by 2 years of grief and desperate hope, in ways that cannot simply be undone, now that the curse is broken." "What are you saying?" Ren gestured, using the shorthand they had developed together during weeks of communication. Faye smiled sadly. "I am saying that I have watched the way he looks at you, quiet healer, and I do not believe it is simple gratitude anymore, if it ever was only that. And I find, to my own surprise, that I am not entirely troubled by this observation. 2 years is a long time for a heart to grieve and adapt, and perhaps mine has adapted in ways that make room for a different kind of future than the one I once imagined for myself and Draven." Ren shook her head firmly, gesturing her strong objection to what Faye seemed to be suggesting, uncomfortable with the idea that her own suppressed feelings might somehow be given permission or encouragement by the very woman she had worked so hard to heal. But Faye reached out and took her hand gently, her expression carrying none of the jealousy or resentment Ren might have expected under different circumstances. "I do not say this to burden you further," Faye said gently. "I say it only because I believe honesty between us serves everyone better than pretending not to notice what is plainly visible. Whatever happens between the 3 of us in the coming months, I would rather face it with clear eyes than with the kind of denial that only breeds greater pain down the road." This conversation left Ren deeply unsettled, and she threw herself back into her infirmary duties with renewed focus, trying to bury her complicated feelings beneath the familiar routine of tending wounds and preparing remedies. But the peace she sought proved elusive, particularly as Draven himself began finding excuses to visit the infirmary more frequently than his position as king would typically require. His presence there noted with increasing curiosity by Edgar and the other servants who worked alongside Ren throughout her days. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to any of them, word of Faye's miraculous recovery had traveled far beyond the fortress walls, reaching eventually the rival pack responsible for casting the original curse. Deep in a distant territory, a pack leader named Silas received this news with considerable displeasure, understanding immediately that his carefully orchestrated revenge against King Draven had been undone by some unknown healer's intervention, a development that threatened years of careful planning, aimed at weakening the northern wolves through the slow torment of their king's grief. Silas began making inquiries of his own, sending spies into the surrounding territories to learn more about this mysterious mute healer who had accomplished what his most powerful curse workers had believed impossible to reverse. He understood, with the calculating patience that had made him a formidable enemy over the years, that eliminating this healer, or better yet, turning her skills toward his own purposes, might provide new avenues for weakening Draven's kingdom that his previous curse had failed to achieve. Back within the fortress, unaware of the dark attention now being directed toward her from distant territories, Ren continued navigating the complicated emotional landscape that had developed among herself, Draven, and Faye, uncertain how any of it would ultimately resolve itself, but increasingly aware that the peaceful conclusion she had hoped for after breaking the curse was proving far more elusive than the technical challenge of the cure itself had been. Silas moved carefully in the weeks that followed, understanding that a direct assault against the Northern Wolves' fortress would accomplish little beyond uniting Draven's forces against an obvious external threat. Instead, he favored subtlety, sending a small group of trusted agents, disguised as traveling merchants, toward the territory surrounding Draven's fortress, tasked with gathering information about the mysterious healer and, if opportunity presented itself, finding some way to use her against the kingdom that had thwarted his carefully laid curse. One of these agents, a woman who called herself Priya, though this was not her true name, managed to secure a position within the fortress itself, presenting forged credentials that identified her as an experienced healer seeking employment, given the fortress's evident need for additional medical staff following the strain of recent events. Edgar, overwhelmed with his usual duties and genuinely impressed by her apparent knowledge during a brief interview, welcomed the additional help without suspecting the true purpose behind her arrival. Ren, whose instincts for reading people had been sharpened by years of careful observation, necessitated by her silence, felt an immediate unease around this new arrival, though she could not articulate precisely what troubled her about the woman's presence. Priya's knowledge of herbs and remedies seemed genuine enough, but something in the careful way she asked questions about Ren's own background, about the specific treatments used to break Faye's curse, struck Ren as calculated rather than simply curious. She mentioned her concerns to Draven during one of their now frequent private conversations, using her careful gestures to convey a wariness she could not fully justify through concrete evidence. Draven listened seriously, understanding by now to trust Ren's instincts even when she could not provide detailed explanations, and he quietly instructed Garrick to keep a discreet watch on the new healer's activities without alerting her to any suspicion. Garrick's observations, gathered over the following days, confirmed that Ren's unease was well-founded. Priya had been seen exchanging brief, seemingly casual conversations with unfamiliar merchants who visited the fortress markets more frequently than typical trade would warrant, and on one occasion, she had been observed slipping away from her assigned duties to explore corridors that held no relevance to her supposed role as an infirmary assistant. Draven confronted this information carefully, unwilling to act rashly against someone who might, despite these suspicious circumstances, prove to be entirely innocent of any harmful intent. He instructed Garrick to continue monitoring while he and Ren discussed how best to protect both Faye's continued well-being and the sensitive knowledge of the curse-breaking treatment that had, thanks to Ren's efforts, finally freed his mate from 2 years of suffering. The situation came to a head sooner than any of them anticipated. Late one evening, Ren discovered Priya in the infirmary's storage room, carefully copying notes from Edgar's journal, which contained detailed records of the various remedies and treatments used throughout the fortress, including several references to the special herbs and techniques Ren had employed in Faye's treatment. Priya startled at Ren's silent approach, quickly attempting to hide the papers she had been copying, but Ren had already seen enough to understand the true nature of the woman's presence within the fortress. Ren backed away quietly, understanding that confronting Priya directly in this moment, without support or the ability to call for help through normal means, would be foolish and potentially dangerous. She hurried instead to find Draven, gesturing urgently once she located him in his study, conveying through rapid, insistent movements the discovery she had just made. Draven acted immediately, summoning Garrick and a small contingent of trusted guards to apprehend Priya before she could destroy evidence or attempt to flee the fortress with whatever information she had already gathered. The confrontation, when it came, revealed exactly what Ren and Draven had feared, that Priya was indeed an agent sent by a rival pack, specifically dispatched to learn the details of the curse-breaking treatment and, if possible, to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited against the healer responsible for undoing months of careful revenge. Under careful questioning, Conducted with firm authority, but without the cruelty the kingdom's stories about Draven might have suggested, Priya eventually revealed the name of her pack leader, Silas, and confirmed that his primary interest lay in understanding how his curse had been broken, information that could presumably help him refine future attempts against other enemies, along with a secondary goal of eliminating or capturing the healer whose skills had proven so troublesome to his plans. This revelation sent a chill through Ren that she had not anticipated, understanding for the first time that her involvement in breaking Faye's curse had made her not merely a valued member of the fortress staff, but an active target for a dangerous enemy pack, willing to use spies and subterfuge to achieve their goals. Draven, watching her reaction to this news, moved immediately to reassure her, though his own expression carried a matching concern for her safety that went beyond simple gratitude for her healing skills. "I will not allow harm to come to you," he said firmly, once Priya had been secured under guard, pending further decisions about her fate. "Whatever measures are necessary to protect you, I will implement them immediately. You have given me back everything that matters most in this world, and I will not stand by while an enemy pack threatens to take you from this fortress in retaliation." Ren appreciated his determination, but she also understood, with the same clear-eyed practicality that had guided her through every difficult situation in her life, that hiding away in fear was not a sustainable solution, nor was it in keeping with who she had built herself to be, over years of learning to survive and thrive, despite the challenges her silence had presented. She gestured her understanding of the danger, but also her refusal to simply retreat from her duties, or her growing role within the fortress community out of fear. Faye, informed of the situation once the immediate crisis had been addressed, expressed genuine alarm at the revelation that Silas's pack had extended their reach directly into the fortress walls, understanding better than anyone the lengths to which their enemy would go to achieve his goals. "Silas is not a leader who accepts defeat easily," she told Ren and Draven during a tense council held in Draven's private study. "If his agent has failed to gather what he needed, he will likely escalate his efforts rather than abandon his interest in undoing what has been accomplished here." The three of them, along with Garrick, spent the following hours discussing potential strategies for protecting Ren and preventing further infiltration attempts, ranging from increased security measures throughout the fortress to the possibility of relocating Ren temporarily to a safer location outside the immediate territory. Ren, through her careful gestures, made clear her preference for remaining within the fortress rather than fleeing, understanding that running from danger had never solved problems in her experience, only delayed confrontations that would eventually need to be faced regardless. Draven, though clearly torn between his instinct to protect her at all costs and his respect for her evident courage and self-determination, eventually agreed to a compromise, increasing security specifically around Ren's movements and quarters, while allowing her to continue her infirmary duties and her growing involvement in the fortress community, provided she remained alert to any further signs of suspicious activity among the staff or visiting merchants. As this immediate crisis was managed, however imperfectly, the underlying tension between Draven, Ren, and Faye remained unresolved, complicated further now by the shared danger they faced from Silas's continued interest in the fortress's affairs. Ren found herself drawn increasingly close to Draven during these tense weeks, their shared concern for security and strategy creating opportunities for private conversation that only deepened the feelings she had been trying so hard to suppress since Faye's recovery. Faye, watching this dynamic unfold with the same clear-eyed honesty she had displayed weeks before, finally approached Draven directly one evening, choosing to address the complicated situation head-on rather than allowing it to fester unspoken beneath the surface of their daily interactions. "I think we all know that something has shifted between the three of us since Ren first came to break my curse," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was addressing. "I do not believe pretending otherwise serves any of us well, particularly not now, when external dangers threaten to complicate matters further if we remain divided by unspoken tensions among ourselves." Draven listened to Faye's words with visible surprise, clearly not expecting her to address the situation so directly, though he did not deny the truth underlying her observation. "I have tried to honor what we once shared," he said carefully, "and I do not wish to cause you pain by acknowledging feelings that have grown in ways I did not anticipate or fully understand myself." Faye reached for his hand, her expression gentle rather than accusatory. "Draven, I spent 2 years trapped in a curse, watching the world from a distance I could not fully bridge. During that time, I had nothing but my own thoughts to occupy me, and I came to understand something important about the nature of love and loss. The version of me who existed before the curse loved you completely, without complication or doubt. But the woman who emerged from that curse is not entirely the same person, shaped as I have been by suffering and time, in ways that cannot simply be erased now that my body has been restored. She continued, her voice growing steadier, as she worked through thoughts she had clearly been considering for some time. I find that I care for you deeply still, as one cares for someone who shared a significant part of one's life. But I do not know if what remains between us is the same passionate devotion we once shared, or something that has settled into a different kind of bond, forged through shared suffering, rather than the simple joy we once knew together. Draven absorbed her words carefully, and Ren, who had been present for this conversation at Faye's specific request, felt her heart pounding at the implications of what Faye seemed to be suggesting. "What are you saying you wish to do?" Draven asked finally, his voice carrying genuine uncertainty rather than defensive denial. "I am saying," Faye replied, "that I believe we should each be honest about what we want, rather than clinging to an expectation of how things should be, simply because of what we once shared, before everything changed. I have thought carefully about this, and I believe my own future may lie in a different direction than remaining as your mate in the way we once imagined, though I hope we can remain connected as friends and allies, given everything we have endured together." This revelation left both Draven and Ren momentarily speechless, understanding that Faye had just voluntarily released Draven from the expectation of resuming their previous romantic bond, offering both of them a freedom they had not dared hope for given the complicated circumstances surrounding Faye's recovery and their own growing feelings for one another. "Are you certain of this?" Draven asked carefully, clearly wanting to ensure Faye was not simply sacrificing her own happiness out of some misplaced sense of obligation or guilt. "I am certain," Faye said firmly, "that forcing myself back into a role that no longer feels entirely authentic to who I have become would serve none of us well in the long run. I would rather face an honest, if complicated future, than cling to a comfortable fiction that denies what has clearly grown between the two of you during these difficult weeks." Ren, overwhelmed by the weight of this conversation and the implications for her own carefully guarded feelings, gestured her gratitude toward Faye, understanding the courage it must have taken to address such a delicate situation with such clear-eyed honesty. Faye smiled at her gently, squeezing her hand once more, before rising to leave the two of them alone, with the new understanding that had just reshaped the complicated dynamic among them. In the days that followed this pivotal conversation, Ren and Draven found themselves navigating a new kind of relationship, no longer bound by the careful restraint they had both maintained, out of respect for Faye's presumed claim on Draven's heart. Their conversations, once focused primarily on the practical matters of curse-breaking and fortress security, began to expand into more personal territory, each of them learning details about the other's past and hopes for the future that they had previously kept carefully guarded. Ren shared more fully the story of her childhood trauma, the fire that had taken her voice, and Draven listened with a patience and genuine attentiveness that made her feel, for the first time in years, that her silence was not a barrier to being truly understood, but simply another aspect of who she was, that deserved the same respect and care as any other part of her character. In turn, Draven spoke more openly about the burdens of leadership he had carried since taking the throne at a young age, the loneliness that came with a position that demanded constant strength and left little room for vulnerability, and the particular pain of the 2 years he had spent hiding his grief while maintaining a fearsome reputation that kept his enemies at bay. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed within the fortress, and while Nora and several of the senior staff members seemed genuinely pleased to see their king finding happiness after so many difficult years, the situation with Silas's continued interest in undermining the fortress's stability remained an ongoing concern that could not be ignored, simply because personal matters had begun resolving themselves more favorably than anyone had anticipated. Garrick, tasked with managing the fortress's security in light of the confirmed infiltration attempt, reported increasing evidence that Silas was indeed escalating his efforts, with additional suspicious activity detected among merchants and travelers passing through the surrounding territory. It became increasingly clear that a direct confrontation with Silas's pack might become unavoidable, if the rival leader continued pursuing his goal of undermining Draven's kingdom through whatever means remained available to him. Ren, drawing on her own instincts and the knowledge she had gained through her involvement in breaking Faye's curse, began contributing to strategic discussions in ways she had never anticipated when she first arrived at the fortress as a simple souled healer with no voice and no expectation of influence beyond her medical duties. Her careful observations about Priya's behavior and the patterns she had noticed among suspicious visitors proved valuable in helping Garrick and Draven anticipate Silas's likely next moves. During one particularly tense strategy session, word arrived that Silas himself was demanding a meeting, sending a formal envoy to request parley, under the guise of negotiating a peaceful resolution to the tensions that had developed since his curse against Faye had been broken. Draven, Garrick, and Faye all expressed considerable skepticism about Silas's true intentions, suspecting that any meeting would likely serve as cover for some further attempt at treachery rather than genuine diplomatic resolution. Ren, however, found herself drawn to a different consideration, wondering whether a carefully managed confrontation might actually provide an opportunity to finally resolve the threat Silas posed, rather than continuing to react defensively to his ongoing attempts at infiltration and sabotage. She gestured this suggestion to Draven during a private moment, watching him consider the risks and potential benefits of taking a more proactive approach to the conflict that had been simmering beneath the surface of the fortress's affairs for weeks. "If we agree to this meeting," Draven said slowly, working through the implications, "we would need to ensure it takes place on our terms, with sufficient protection to prevent any attempt at treachery, while also creating conditions that might allow us to finally end this threat definitively, rather than continuing to defend against his ongoing schemes indefinitely." The decision, ultimately, was made to accept Silas's request for parley, but with careful conditions, designed to protect everyone involved, while creating an opportunity for the conflict to reach its resolution, one way or another, rather than continuing indefinitely in the shadows, through spies and subterfuge. Ren, despite the danger this decision might pose to her personally, given Silas's apparent interest in her specifically, insisted on being present for whatever confrontation followed, understanding that her role in breaking the curse made her an essential part of whatever resolution might finally bring peace to the fortress and its people. The meeting was arranged to take place at a neutral location along the border between the two territories, a wide clearing surrounded by ancient trees that had, according to old records, hosted similar negotiations between rival packs for generations before either Draven or Silas had been born. Garrick oversaw the security arrangements personally, positioning trusted guards at strategic points throughout the surrounding forest, while ensuring that the immediate clearing appeared, to any observer, to hold only the minimal escort that traditional parley customs required. Ren traveled with Draven's party, her nerves steady despite the danger, drawing on the same calm resolve that had carried her through every difficult healing she had ever performed. Faye insisted on accompanying them as well, understanding that Silas's original curse had been directed at her specifically, and that her presence, fully recovered and clearly thriving, would serve as powerful proof that his years of careful scheming had ultimately failed to achieve their intended purpose. Silas arrived at the appointed hour, flanked by a small contingent of his own guards, his expression carrying the calculated confidence of a leader who believed he still held some advantage, despite the failure of his infiltration attempt. He was younger than Ren had expected, with sharp features and cold eyes that swept over their party with obvious assessment, lingering longest on Ren herself, confirming her suspicion that she had indeed become a primary target of his continued interest. "I see the healer who undid my work still lives," Silas said, his voice carrying a false pleasantness that did nothing to disguise the threat underlying his words. "I must admit, I am curious how a mute servant girl managed to accomplish what my most skilled curse workers assured me was impossible to reverse." Draven stepped slightly in front of Ren, his posture radiating the same fearsome authority that had made the northern wolves so formidable throughout his reign. "Whatever skill she possesses is no longer your concern, Silas. You requested this meeting, claiming interest in peaceful resolution. I suggest you address that stated purpose, rather than pursuing further interest in matters that do not concern you." Silas's expression flickered with barely concealed irritation at being redirected so directly, though he maintained his composed demeanor. "Very well, I will speak plainly then. My curse against your mate was intended to weaken your kingdom through your own grief and distraction. a strategy that would have succeeded admirably had this healer not intervened. I am prepared to offer a genuine peace, provided you agree to hand over the healer responsible for undoing my work, allowing me to understand her methods and, perhaps, employ her particular skills for my own purposes going forward. The audacity of this demand hung heavy in the clearing, and Ren felt a surge of anger cut through her fear, understanding that Silas viewed her not as a person deserving of consideration, but simply as a tool to be acquired for his own advantage, regardless of her own wishes, or the devastating impact such a transfer would have on the people who had come to genuinely care for her within Draven's fortress. "That demand is unacceptable," Draven said, his voice carrying a low, dangerous edge that made several of Silas's guards shift uncomfortably. "Ren is not property to be traded or bargained away. She is a valued member of my kingdom, and her well-being and freedom are not subject to negotiation." Faye stepped forward as well, her restored voice carrying clear conviction, despite the 2 years of silence the curse had forced upon her. "Silas, your curse failed. Accept that reality and withdraw your threats, or face the consequences of continuing hostilities against a kingdom that has clearly demonstrated it will not be weakened by your schemes." Silas's calculated composure finally cracked slightly, frustration bleeding through, as he realized his demand would not be met through simple negotiation. "You believe yourselves victorious simply because one curse failed," he said, his voice growing colder. "I have other resources at my disposal, other methods of ensuring your continued suffering, King Draven. This healer of yours cannot protect your kingdom forever." Ren, watching this exchange unfold, felt a surge of determination overtake her earlier fear, understanding that this confrontation represented an opportunity not simply to defend herself, but to demonstrate definitively that Silas's schemes, however many resources he might claim to possess, would not succeed in undermining the genuine strength that Draven's kingdom had built through loyalty, courage, and hard-won healing, rather than fear and manipulation. She stepped forward deliberately, drawing surprised glances from both Draven's party and Silas's guards, unaccustomed as they were to the mute healer taking such a bold, visible stance during a tense diplomatic confrontation. She gestured firmly, using motions she had refined over years of careful communication, conveying a message that Draven, understanding her meaning immediately, translated aloud for the benefit of those present who could not read her gestures as fluently as he had learned to over the preceding weeks. "She says," Draven announced, his voice carrying newfound respect for Ren's courage, "that whatever resources you claim to possess, Silas, you will find that this kingdom's strength lies not in any single healer's skill, but in the genuine bonds of loyalty and care that your schemes have consistently failed to account for. She says that a leader who rules through fear and manipulation, as you clearly do, will never understand the kind of strength that comes from people choosing to stand together freely, rather than being coerced or threatened into submission." Silas's expression darkened considerably at these words, understanding that his intended intimidation had failed to produce the desired effect, and that instead, this confrontation had only served to further unite the very people he had hoped to divide and weaken. Recognizing that continued negotiation would achieve nothing further, and unwilling to risk direct confrontation against Draven's clearly superior position, given the security Garrick had arranged throughout the surrounding forest, Silas withdrew his party from the clearing, with a final, venomous glare directed at Ren, promising through his cold silence that this conflict was far from truly resolved, even if this particular confrontation had ended without further immediate escalation. The journey back to the fortress carried a mixture of relief and continued vigilance, understanding that while this immediate crisis had been navigated successfully, Silas's underlying hostility remained a threat that would likely require ongoing attention in the months ahead. But for the moment, the fortress could return to a measure of peace, its people secure in the knowledge that their king and his healer had stood firm against external threats, seeking to exploit their kingdom's vulnerabilities. In the weeks that followed, life within the fortress settled into a new and generally happier rhythm. Faye, true to her earlier declaration, embraced a role as a valued advisor and friend within Draven's court, rather than resuming her previous position as his mate, finding genuine purpose in helping manage the fortress's affairs, alongside Garrick and the other senior commanders. Her first-hand experience with Silas's cruelty, giving her valuable insight into anticipating and countering the rival pack's ongoing schemes. Draven and Ren, no longer constrained by the careful distance they had maintained during phase recovery, and the subsequent period of uncertainty about the true nature of their feelings, allowed their relationship to develop openly, their bond deepening through continued shared experiences and mutual respect that had been forged through weeks of desperate, secret work to save someone they both cared for deeply. The fortress staff, having witnessed the genuine transformation in their king's demeanor since Ren's arrival, welcomed this development with the same warmth Nora had shown from the very beginning, understanding that whatever unconventional path had brought the mute healer into their king's life, the result had clearly been beneficial for everyone within the fortress community. Ren herself found, in the months that followed, a sense of belonging and purpose she had never dared imagine possible during her difficult years in her home village, where her silence had marked her as an outsider, deserving of pity rather than genuine respect. Here, within the walls of a fortress she had once entered as frightened cargo in a peace tribute, she had found not only a chance to use her healing gifts to their fullest potential, but a genuine family, built from unlikely circumstances, a king who valued her courage and skill above any conventional expectation, and a friend in Faye, whose honesty and grace had allowed all three of them to navigate an impossibly complicated situation with dignity rather than heartbreak. When Draven finally declared before his full court that Ren would stand beside him not merely as his healer, but as his chosen mate and future queen, the announcement was met not with the shock or resistance that might have greeted such news months before, but with genuine celebration, from a kingdom that had watched their king transform, from a man consumed by hidden grief, into a leader capable of both fierce strength and genuine tenderness. A transformation they understood, correctly, to be entirely due to the quiet, unassuming healer, who had once been sold into their fortress with no voice, and no expectation of anything beyond simple servitude, and who had instead found within these walls a love, a purpose, and a home that no one, least of all Ren herself, could have anticipated when she first arrived through that iron gate all those months before.